Hi, I'm Katrin Park. Today we bring you a special episode on the state of food security and nutrition in the world report. Published by 5 UN agencies every year, the report is the most comprehensive global evidence base on food security and nutrition. Healthy diets have become so expensive that 1/3 of the world's population cannot afford them. That's the focus of this year's report: why healthy diets cost so much and what to do about it. We record this special episode in the library of the FAO Museum. Welcome to the work we do. In my left, I'm joined by Maximo Torero, FAO's chief economist, and on my right, I'm joined by David Laborde, division director of Agrifood Economics and Policy. Maximo, what are the major findings of this year's report?
Thank you, Katrin. So this year report what shows is that for the third consecutive year, the number of hungry people is declining, which is good news. However, the improvements are uneven and they vary by region. They are fragile and also insufficient to achieve the SDG 2, which is what we want by 2030. But the important thing is that we keep accelerating the decline. If we look specifically to the numbers, we find that 7.8% of the global population face hunger in 2025, down from 8.1% in 2024 and 8.6% in 2022. What this means in terms of number of people, it means 645 million people are today in hunger in 2025. And this is a reduction of 14 million with respect to 2024 and 43 million with respect to 2022. So the numbers are complex. Heterogeneity among regions. The major improvement is happening in Latin America and the Caribbean, specifically in South America, and also in Asia, South Asia, specifically mostly driven by the improvements in India. Now, the report also shows that it's not just an issue of reduction of hunger and improving the nutrition indicators. It also shows that it's important to look at the affordability and the costs and how much people are eating healthy diets. In this report, we look at affordability first, and we show that 2.6 billion people are not yet able to afford a healthy diet. But clearly, it's not just the affordability by itself, which is linked to income, but it's also linked to the cost of the healthy diet, which is the second part of the report. And of course, finally, something that we still don't measure is how much people really are eating a healthy diet. At the end, what we want is bigger consumption of a healthy diet because we want to reduce undernutrition and overnutrition and to reduce non-communicable diseases. And that's what the healthy diet will bring. So again, the 2.6 billion number is still extremely high and it's something that we need to tackle. And the second part of this report look at the cost, only the cost of the healthy diet.
David, so Maximo just talked about affordability, but there's more to it, no?
Yes, and as Maximo has said, we are talking about here also a big number about the cost. The non-communicable disease related cost for economy is $8.1 trillion a year. So big cost for the economy. And it starts with actually a big cost for people. And this big cost for people is how much it costs to consume and buy these healthy diets. And that's what we do in the report this year. We really try to understand the situation, why these costs are so high. And as you said, and as Maximo have said, there's first an affordability issue. If we were all rich, the cost will not matter. But in the world of today, it's not the case. And rising inflation in the last few years has put this issue of the cost, how much you pay at the grocery shop, even more prominent. Because in the last 5 years, the cost of a healthy diet has risen by 25%. So today it's $4.28 in PPP. So it's a way that we need to adjust for different cost of living across the world because the current exchange rate, for instance, are biased. If you look at the news, you will see that some country may have a currency that is over-evaluated or under-evaluated. So just looking at prices and using exchange rates will not do the job. So we need to adjust. So $4.28, it's already much more, unfortunately, than the extreme poverty line, that is $3 PPP. So the conclusion is we are pricing out of consumption 1/3 of mankind. And that's what we want to solve. And that's what we explain in the report what means this number, but also $4.28 in average means very different prices around the world. And we have lower cost actually in high-income countries. So in the places where people are richer, costs are lower.
Mm-hmm.
And why? It's because these economies are more efficient. They produce food more efficiently. They transport food more efficiently. They process food more efficiently. When at the opposite, in a number of low and middle income countries, these prices are higher. Now, it's not all products that are more expensive everywhere. And so we need to unpack this box. And that's why we see that animal food products are expensive in Africa, when fruit and vegetables are more expensive in Europe or in Asia. And it means that we will need to look at different solutions adapted to its context. And that's the last part of the report. Beyond the diagnostic, we want to go about solution, what we can do to produce food more efficiently, but the right food we need, so much more investment in horticulture, or we reduce post-harvest losses, especially for this perishable product, and how we also make sure that we have the right level of competition, because between the farmer to the consumer today, you have a large gap. So basically, when you go to the grocery shop, 75% of the cost is not about the primary production of food. So we need to make sure that we intervene along the value chain. And we cover these different aspects in the report.
Okay. Why are fruits and vegetables more expensive in Europe and animal source food more expensive in Africa?
So in Europe, fruit and vegetables are more expensive because they are labor-intensive activities, basically. And also the weather in Europe is not a tropical weather. So you have less weather, less sun, and the people that will harvest the food and you want to pick fruits and vegetables, a lot of this is still handmade. Labor cost matter. In Africa, it's different because in Africa, actually, fruits are still very inexpensive, even if there's still a lot of losses along the value chain. Actually, the productivity is so high and the availability is so high that these prices are low, but it's very different for animal products. Milk, eggs, meat is expensive. They are expensive because you don't have all the modern infrastructure in terms of cold storage for this product, but also in terms of vaccination for the livestock. And so the modernization of the livestock sector has still not really scaled up in Africa, also because the cost of feed is important. And that's why, having an agri-food system approach is important. Understanding the specific value chain is important to do the right thing at the right place.
And isn't the cost of healthy diets also expensive in Latin America, which seems ironical because they export a lot of food?
Yes. So, but also what Latin America exports the most is staple. It's soybean, it's maize, it's wheat. That's where the big exporters are. But at the same time, and also meat. But also at the same time, you have some countries in Latin America that are very good at exporting fruit and vegetables. So now the problem is, behind this regional average, you have a lot of differences. And when we think about Latin America, we also have to think about some islands in the Caribbean. And here, transportation cost has a real impact. But also we have all this connectivity within countries in Latin America that can be a challenge. So if you have a very export-oriented model, you try to be very efficient to export, not to bring some of this good to your population. And that's some of the paradox we need to address with the right balance of policies.
Let me add something there, because coming from Latin America, I know a little bit about Latin America. So one dimension that is important to capture here is trade, no? Which is important. And even Europe imports high-value commodities. Asia imports high-value commodities from Latin America and also from other parts of the world. So the cost that we are observing in those countries is even lower because of this supply coming through the trade part. But specifically in the case of Latin America, when we refer to fruits and vegetables, and the major countries exporting fruits and vegetables are basically the Andean countries, so Ecuador, Colombia, and Peru, and Chile. The challenge there is that the agro-industry has focused on varieties of products which are for export, specifically, which are too expensive for local consumers. And that's why what we are reflecting in terms of the cost of a healthy diet is that level of how expensive these commodities are. That opens the question, and I think it doesn't mean that we should reduce the export-oriented. It means that we need to start thinking seriously how we can assure local supply of these fruits and vegetables in these countries also, so that we start lowering the cost. It's important to bring this balance between production and export-oriented because we need the revenues, and we need to diversify markets so that we can also lower that cost of the healthy diet.
And in the report, you will see how we do this matching between what type of intervention and where. So in the case of Latin America, actually, additional connectivity to global market is not a priority, but focusing more on domestic market integration is a priority. When for other parts of the world, we still need to increase this connection. Because actually what we will see, landlocked country today pay a much higher price for their healthy diets than countries that are on the shore.
And that's exactly what you're saying also on seeds, because seeds imports most of the food, and Caribbean islands are the most expensive in terms of the cost of the healthy diets.
Seeds, small island, developing states. Okay. So Maximo, you talked about trade, supply and demand. There is an example that has to do with quinoa, no? Would you like to tell us about that?
This is an example that happened in the past. A few years ago, as you know, there was an increase in the demand of quinoa because it's a superfood. They're nutritious, proteins and so on. So people internationally start to like quinoa. And that created a boost in demand. The challenge was that the supply was not ready. And therefore it increased locally prices of a staple that was extremely important to reduce anemia and malnutrition in poor parts of Latin America, especially in Peru and Bolivia. Now, we have learned from that. And now we understand that we have to look at the supply and demand at the same time, simultaneously. Although it cannot be so simultaneous, you have to start preparing the supply so that you can respond when the demand comes. Because what we saw in quinoa is that demand comes very quickly, and then it moves up, and you don't have the supply. And then local prices increases, you start to move into areas which are more complex, you create pests and diseases. So again, it's a lesson learned. As David was saying, we need to focus on both supply and demand, and we need to be prepared so that local consumption is not affected at the same time.
Maximo, the report finds that the rate of hunger has slightly declined in Africa, but it's more complex than that. Is it?
Yes. So look, for me, it's extremely good news that finally, although very fragile, we are seeing a stabilization of African numbers in terms of rates from 20.3 to 20.0%, which is an improvement, but it's a very small improvement. But the point is not the magnitude necessarily. The point is that we are no longer having an increasing rate. Now, but in terms of numbers, the story is different. And why? Because Africa is growing at a very high population rate, more than 2%. Asia is not. Population rate growth in Asia has declined substantially. And as a result of that, today we have 309 million people that are in hunger in Africa compared to 292 million people in Asia. So it's the first time that the SOFI reports that the number of hungry people in Africa is higher than in Asia, despite this small decline in the rate. Now, that's something that we need to work carefully because we need to try to find structural solutions to this. We need to take advantage of this reduction, small reduction or stabilization of the rate, and we need to accelerate. But for me, are good news. And why are also good news? Is because we have faced in the last year significant challenges. So a counterfactual will be a world where there was no COVID, a world there was no war in Ukraine, a world where there was no Strait of Hormuz, and a world where there was not a cut of ODA for Africa of more than 20 or 25%.
ODA, official development assistance,
Exactly.
yes.
So I think given that counterfactual and still having a slight improvement is good news. We need to accelerate that. That does not mean at all that we should continue reducing ODA. On the contrary, we need to use ODA in the best possible way to be able to accelerate that rate and to reduce the absolute number.
We spoke to some consumers in a market in Nairobi, and the general sentiment was that the cost of food was going up. Healthy foods, including fruits, vegetables, and animal source foods. Take a look.
The prices of things have gone up. Some things go down a little, while others go up. But right now, prices are high. For example, right now these tomatoes are 5,000 Kenyan shillings. Before, they used to be 4,500 or 3,500. Cooking oil has also gone up, and other things like sugar, meat, and flour.
The prices of basic necessities, things that people need every day, such as sugar, cooking oil, and even milk, have become very expensive. Especially milk. You know, it's something that every family needs.
I am someone who likes fish and meat, but those things have become very expensive. I cannot eat meat.
David, how should we understand this based on the report?
So what you have just heard is the reality. Consumers are facing these increased prices. Now, Africa is a very diverse place, so it doesn't mean that all these prices increase at the same speed everywhere. But what we see that first, the average cost of healthy diets in Africa, it's $4.33. So actually, it's higher than the average cost in the world at $4.28 PPP. So behind this average number, what we see is animal source food is pretty expensive. Actually, it represents 35% of the cost of a healthy diet in Africa compared to 28% globally. But we see also that, yes, fruit and vegetable in some locations, in particular in cities, are very expensive because there's a lot of post-harvest losses. So once again, we should not make general statements about Africa, but we see this pattern, and it's going to be important to guide action and solution. Because as Maximo has said, we have still a rising number of people in chronic hunger in Africa, but the rate is stabilizing. At the same time, there is one aspect of the story that is getting worse, including in Africa, is obesity. So now we have nearly 140 million people in Africa that are obese. So 310 million people, 309 in chronic hunger, 140 already obese. If we look at East Africa, it's 120 million people in chronic hunger and 120 million that are overweight. So it's not as extreme as obesity, but really have this double burden of malnutrition. And that's where the cost of healthy diets matters. And it's even matter more in Africa today because the continent continues to urbanize very quickly. So lifestyles are changing. And if we cannot get in city the right cost of healthy diets, we will face this problem. And having this rising obesity, having this problem of non-communicable disease, mean that health costs are going to increase in the future. It also means that labor productivity can go down in the future, and Africa needs more economic growth, not less.
And it's important to come again with the three elements behind diet. So one is the cost, as you were explaining, but Africa also faces significant challenges in income. GDP growth is not going at the level, and the levels of incomes are not so high. So the affordability is a problem. And of course, later is the consumption issue. So I think that brings up the three dimensions.
Exactly. And of course, we need to bring down the cost for all consumers, because in Africa, it's nearly 3/4 of the people that cannot afford the healthy diets. But we also need to make sure we create the right demand condition and we protect some of the more vulnerable groups with targeted intervention. Because especially if you don't have too much money, you want to target well this money in terms of social protection, in terms of school feeding program, for instance.
So, David, you mentioned school feeding programs. In many parts of Africa, school meals are actually mostly cereals with very little fruits and vegetables. Could you tell us more about school meals, Maximo?
Yes. Look, let me go a little bit broader. If we look at why South America and why Asia is improving, it's because of two sets of policies. One is about social protection, as David was saying, and how we can properly target social protection. And that includes school feeding programs. And the other one is about agriculture and how we can improve productivity and efficiency using less inputs, being sustainable. But if we focus on the social protection part and we focus on the cash transfers and conditional cash transfers, one of the major programs that have been very successful and is one of the reasons why countries like Dominican Republic, for example, is reducing hunger a lot and moving out of the hunger map, and Brazil and other countries in Latin America, is because of the quality of what you bring in the school feeding programs. And yes, we still see a big challenge. We have to, if we look at the school feeding programs right now in the poorest countries, the urgency is to supply the minimum calories they need. But we need to change that, and that needs to be changed structurally. We need to learn to what happened in Latin America, what is happening in Asia, and other parts of the world, how we can also bring to these kids a healthy diet. And that means diversity. Of course, they will have some staples, but they also need to have fruits. They need to have vegetables. And that is essential because that's what will make the difference for today, but also for tomorrow. Because these kids will have better macronutrients because of these healthy diets, and they will be healthier in the future. And that's what we try to achieve. So that needs to change. And the lessons learned is that this is a way to do that, and we need to learn from other countries that have done it.
David, we're facing many challenges. The input cost is rising, extreme weather events, an El Nino event developing. How does that change or affect the cost of healthy diets?
So it's impact the cost of healthy diet. It's impact also our fight against hunger. I mean, the number that Maximo was discussing were largely driven by the COVID situation a few years ago. But since then, the COVID situation has been resolved, but hunger has been persistent. So basically, our progresses or capacity to reduce hunger has slowed down due to this shock. And there are geopolitical shock, there is conflict within countries, across countries. We also see how energy shock and fertilizer shock is impacting the capacity to produce it at a good price, including for some value chain, like the one we discussed today, in terms of fruit and vegetables, how they have been actually more impacted in some cases because you need cold storage, you need energy for irrigation. So all of this make them particularly vulnerable to this type of shock. So when we look a bit ahead, what we see that even without major shock, we will still have 500 million people in chronic hunger in 2030. Now, the more shock we put, the more complicated it's going to get to this number or actually to do better. And in the report, we talk a bit about this future. We show that even how the current situation can lead to 20 million more people in chronic hunger by 2030 because this shock accumulates. This shock not only, as we said, increase the price of food, can increase even more the price of healthy food, but also, as Maximo have said, can erode economic growth. So if you have less income, all of this become more complicated for individual when you have to pay your food, but also for country to scale up the right solution.
We must understand, and it's important that we will continue to face these compound risks. Now, it's not only increase on frequency and intensity of climate events, and apparently we are going to expect a very deep El Nino, but we are also facing geopolitical challenges. We are facing in Africa increasing conflict, which is a reflection also of the numbers in terms of hunger. So I think we have learned also here, and we are a little bit more resilient than we were before, even for El Nino. I think we need to have more tools available, anticipatory action tools, predicting tools that will help countries to make decisions early in advance. Countries are now getting ready for El Nino. India is working very hard because of the delay of the monsoon. Latin America is preparing how they can accelerate harvest to be able to cope with the situation. So, and also FAO and other agencies have more tools available. In NOAA, we have early warning systems, we have predictive tools that we can share, and we have also stocks, which are important right now and could help us to cope in the situation of these compound effects. But we need to be prepared. The conclusion, I think, for me, is that the only way this declining trend will continue in the future is if we are prepared and we are resilient both in prevention, but also in capacity of absorption. So prevention is early warning systems, insurance tools. Capacity of absorption is social protection, productive interventions, innovation in resistance crops to climate, innovation in resistance crops to excess of water, and also trade. I think trade will be central, and we just produce a report on that, how important trade is for resilience. So that's the way we need to look forward, and that's the way I hope we can, despite of all these shocks, continue to see the decline on hunger in the world.